for Savannah River on iodine 129. So
Yeah.
yeah.
As part of groundwater or something else? Yep.
Yeah, yeah, the groundwater issue in the F area. So
I'm all for it.
So Lara, do we have a quorum yet?
Yes, I think we can go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for being here. And we are very happy to have Kevin here to present. So Kevin Brown is a research associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Vanderbilt. His research is supported by CREST. And currently his research focuses on life cycle risk evaluation, model integration, uncertainty quantification, and waste management issues related to cementitious barriers and waste forms for nuclear applications. So after graduating Vanderbilt with his BE and MS, he worked for 16 years at Savannah River Laboratory, where he was recognized as a DOE complex-wide authority in process and product control for radioactive waste vitrification. And then from 2002 to 2003, he spent some time at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, Austria, where he estimated potential transboundary radiation doses resulting from hypothetical accidents at Russian Pacific Fleet sites. And they were the first known studies in the West. And then in 2003, he returned to Vanderbilt to get his PhD, which he received in 2008. And he has also participated in many DOE project peer reviews, including several for the waste treatment and immobilization plant at Hanford and the salt waste processing facility at Savannah River. And then recently he was part of the Vanderbilt CREST team supporting the FFRDC team as directed by Congress to conduct the very successful follow-on analysis of the treatment of supplemental waste at the Hanford site. And so today he will be presenting on his kind of full circle career. And Kevin, I will let you take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Lara. So yeah, today I couldn't really come up with a good title, and I'll show you why in a minute. But today I was asked to talk about my early career through where I am today, and there we go. And Lara already mentioned I'm a research associate professor at Vanderbilt. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my career path from Vanderbilt, where I got my bachelor's and master's, to Savannah River Lab. And it has had many names after. So the Idaho and the Savannah River people always have like 4 names for where they work, if they work there long enough. IASA, which is the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, and then back to Vanderbilt. So more of my stories have great mentors. I was going to say something about genetics, but I'm told that's offensive, so I didn't go there. But that's also part of it. So why did I say full circle, but it's probably more like full triangle? Started at Vanderbilt working for Frank Parker, ended up at Savannah River Lab, went to Austria for a brief period of time. Then, as Lara pointed out, 2003, I came back to get my PhD. I've been on at Vanderbilt since. And as you can see, relative to people these days, well, they'll have 3 to 7 careers and 12 plus jobs. Mine is a little less exciting than that. So I've done these cheesy MATLAB maps to kind of show where I go from place to place. So bear with me on that. Come on, update. There we go. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Savannah River Laboratory. So after graduating Vanderbilt with my bachelor's, I was taking a class with Frank Parker, and I was very close to having to leave Vanderbilt my senior year when he found a way to get me a fellowship, a DOE fellowship. And as part of that in the summer, I had a choice of Idaho, Hanford, or Savannah River. And since we're being honest, Savannah River was closest to the beaches that I knew. So I ended up at Savannah River in 1985. And what I'm showing on the maps are basically the sites that I spent most of my time dealing with in red, and then the places I traveled either for classes or for conferences or whatever in blue. And that's sort of how I'm doing this. So it was a very interesting experience. So I had the DOE management internship. And let me just say now, I can't think of anything more dreadful than listening to me for 45 minutes without interruption. So please, if you have questions or comments, please just go ahead and let me know. I can't see hands raised. So Lara or Jody, please let me know and we'll go ahead and stop, or you can just sing out and we'll stop and address it at the time. So in 85, under, Frank Parker, I got the special fellowship, sent me to Savannah River for that summer, where I worked on starting up a pilot PU-238 waste incinerator. Basically, it's PLC and the data acquisition air compressor systems. So one thing I'm going to talk about is don't always assume that if you're young, and many of you are young, that you don't have the answers. First day on the job in 1985 that summer, I looked at the air compressor system and it didn't look right to me. And then spent the day pulling all the blueprints, looking at the system, finally dragging all the engineers into a room and pointing out that the air compressor system was hooked up wrong. If they had turned it on, it would have been problematic because everything was going in and nothing was coming out. That could cause a problem. And they had just had the vendor in the previous day, so they thought it was fine. So sometimes you do know what you're talking about, even if you're dealing with a bunch of old people like I am now. So keep in mind that if something looks wrong, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this later, go with your gut. Your gut, informed by analytical thinking, is really a good way to solve problems and think about things. So again, in '86, I went back as part of my master's thesis research to finish that work where I developed a concurrent real-time diagnostic system for that incinerator, and that became my master's thesis topic. And as I like to say, I'm one of the people who put AI in a coma back in the the 80s and 90s, and now it's resurrected again, which is good to see. In '87, I started at DuPont. They asked me to stay on. I started working on the Defense Waste Processing Facility. That's a facility that makes glass out of the low volume, high activity fraction, what we call high level waste at Savannah River. Now, whether they should or not is a different story. To put that in a borosilicate glass. So I worked on the chemical side of that at the beginning. And the nice thing about DuPont in those days, I worked for a guy named John Plotnick. And when I worked for John, he's like, 4 days of the week, you're mine. You do what I need you to do, and you do it well, and you never hear from me. 5th day, learn a programming language, learn something that's useful to your future life. And I learned 6 or 7 programming languages working for John in that first year. So it was a fantastic first experience working at Savannah River then. Westinghouse came in the late 80s, called it the Savannah River Technology Center instead of Savannah River Laboratory. So we see this thing mixed, where I started working on the chemical process control strategy for the DOPF. And then this is just me working through that process control strategy all the way up until 2002 when I left. And a lot of it was just refining, implementing that process product control strategy for the DOPF over that period of time. And then when I left, I was responsible for product control, experimental design, UQ, all this stuff throughout all of our vitrification related projects. So basically that first work, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technical stuff I was working on. But one of the things I learned was don't take no for an answer. That Pee-wee, when I showed them the air compressor system was hooked up wrong, they felt it necessary to ignore it until I dragged them all in the room and showed them the blueprints. So sometimes if you're right, you need to actually, look out for yourself and don't take no for an answer. The guy who helped me, the DuPont statistician, who helped me with all the product control and the statistical process control that we developed for DOPF that was very successful, there's been changed very little since 1996 when I implemented and did the first RAD batch, was a guy named Dick Postles. Well, Dick was an interesting guy to work with, if any of you know him. I went to him to ask him if he could help me, and his response was, I'm going to clean this up, who the heck are you, and get out of my office. That was what that's not verbatim, but you get the flavor. So I sat down and said, well, who the heck do you think you are? And then we got along fabulously afterwards. Within a month, he had moved into my office and started helping me with the OPF, to the fact that a month later, his boss called me and says, do you know where Dick Postles is? I'm like, he's been in my office for a month, didn't you know? So he was an interesting guy to work with. Some of us are old enough to remember the 60s, don't trust anyone over 30 until you, of course, turn 30. That goes back to when I was a young guy and they didn't want to listen to me. Sometimes you have to make yourself heard. So that's very important in life. You got to keep the job interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But in that early 2000s period, when I got kind of tired of working on DOPF because it worked, and now we were just tweaking and I wanted to move on to the next thing, budgetary reasons kind of prevented me from moving on to something else. So in that vein, I was sent to Hanford to work on immobilized low activity waste, so glass for low activity waste, which I don't want to get into, but it was not really what I wanted to do. And that was part of the reasons that I left. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I say get a life because I used to work 80, 120-hour weeks and things like this. And there was a Sunday not long after DPF started up where Bill Holscheider, my level 3, I guess he was at the time, called me on a Sunday about 4 o'clock. And when he was done talking, I was like, Bill, how'd you know I'd be at the office? He's like, I just assumed you'd be at the office. So make sure you have a life, because I didn't have one at the time. So it's always good to have other things that you're interested in. So I'm going to talk real quick about a couple things we did. This is the statistical process control system for vitrification. I must admit, the interesting talks I have are so old now that they won't open in PowerPoint, and I didn't have time to convert them. So I went with this one, which was from the late 90s. We were kind of developing everything. Actually, after things had been installed, and we were trying to apply this to other things. So bear with me in the format because I know it's pretty stark these days. But we were just learning to use these things back in those days. My most interesting talks are actually on physical overheads. So I don't have those anymore. Carol Jansen may, but I don't have those. So the idea is how to immobilize the radioactive waste in a very durable borosilicate glass form. And this is done, as I said, in the DOPF. So you have a lot of streams that have to be blended. And it's funny, back in those days, the streams we consider highly variable, they were difficult to characterize and still are, but they're not that variable relative to, say, the Hanford streams. So it's an interesting thing when you look back on this and see how many changes or how many things you learn over the years from where you were before. You can't, once you make glass out of it, you're not going to grind up the glass and throw it back in the melter. You have to handle it as a special case. That's a not acceptable in the kind of not acceptable realm. And you want to make as little of that unacceptable glass as you can. So there's a lot of constraints, both on the property, the durability of the glass is very important, as you might guess. And then things like can you keep from screwing up your melter? Viscosity, crystallization, things like that. You have to control all this based upon the composition going into the melter, because you can't do anything in the melter itself, except for temperature, but that you tend to fix and leave that go. And as I said, a lot of this stuff you can't measure in the process itself. I'm going to look and see, okay, the timing. So again, you're blending this is very interesting that anybody who is old enough, most of this on the screen has changed. The DFPF is not changed, but the incinerator, let's say that's not there anymore. The in-tank precipitation process where it says precipitate, that's not there anymore. That is salt waste processing facility. So you're getting that component out of that instead. The slurry receipt and adjustment tank is the same. The slurry mix evaporate melter feed, that stuff's the same. But a lot of stuff up to the left is a little different now. It's a lot different now than it was then. So basically, it's how you combine these streams before you melt it to make sure you're going to make good glass. So again, you got the stuff that's coming out of the precipitate, now SWPF. Again, this was done in 1998, so I'm not about to change the presentation to make it update. This is what we were thinking at the time. So you have to blend these streams through heels in the various process vessels in a way that you can definitively say it's going to make an acceptable glass. So the acceptability part, is it going to be durable? Is it not going to be a multi-phase glass, so homogeneous glass? Is it going to not crystallize and screw up your ability to make glass or joule heat? And is the viscosity going to be in the range that makes sure it doesn't foam and that you can get out of the melter when you need it to? So this is basically what we were doing through the process. So again, you're doing it on feed composition, should say mechanistic models. I thought they had changed that. May say that somewhere else, because it's not first principles, it's mechanistic. So how do you derive that target to make sure you're going to make good glass? We use rigorous multivariate statistical process control theory. Sorry for the acronyms, but this was DOE world, so I cleaned up most of the ones that I found. I missed some of them. And then we use that system, that product composition control system, PCCS, to control the 10 scale pilot facility for DOPF, the shielded cave, which is actually where you do the real radioactive waste in a shielded cave facility, all the way to glass, and then lab scale facilities. So we use that in a number of places. And basically the whole idea is you're trying to make this glass with as much sludge, as much waste in it as possible to meet those processing constraints with all the uncertainties you have to deal with. So you have input, feed, and processing, glass property prediction, because you're, again, going from composition to glass properties, sampling, prep measurements. And again, one of the, Lou Landon used to call it weapons grade glass because we're making waste glass, but to these insane tolerances. As I told him, I think our tolerances may have been higher, but it was a very interesting process to go through. Come on. And basically this was all the blending, the constraints, the uncertainty quantification, how you go from these various properties to the region where you want to process in composition space. That's in the lower left hand on that ternary. We have frit, which is the glass formers that you add. And we're a little different from Hanford in a number of ways. And in DOPF, you have just a single frit. You don't use individual trim chemicals. You have a single frit that you qualify before the process or before you do that batch to make sure it's going to have result in acceptable properties, including how fast it's going to melt. So this is how the system is combined and represents all the way from constraint space to property prediction and targeting space. And just because I spent 3 years writing Lisp code, about 20,000 lines, to do the PCCS, this is what it actually looked like on a Symbolics workstation without the colors. And then this was simplified to actually go into the process where once we did that and we dealt with all the variances, we dealt with the uncertainty quantification, how we blended, we got a cost savings of about $30 million per year. Because again, these things are expensive to run. So we maximize waste loading, minimize the waste volume, use rigorous multivariate statistical theory to do that. And it was so at the time, the George Westinghouse Signature Award was the highest award you could get in Westinghouse. This got the 93 award for that. So it seemed to be pretty successful. And I'm going to just real quickly go through the next one. The most limiting constraint is what's called liquidus temperature. So liquidus temperature is the equilibrium temperature between the melt and the primary crystalline phase, which in our glasses, because we have all the iron in there, is a nickel iron spinel. And the melt typically runs about 11 to 1150 degrees centigrade. We tend to limit it about 1050 because there's always a lot of uncertainty in this sort of limit when you're trying to predict crystallization in a melt. But this is the most limiting constraint. So we spent a few years with PNNL and others designing glasses and revising this model. You can't measure this in the process. By the time you figure out crystallization is a problem, you're fixing your melter. So the original model was defined based upon 22 glasses that the compositions weren't measured for. They were as batch. There's a lot of issues with that original model. So we went through, we designed new compositions over the expected region. We measured them. PNNL measured the liquidus temperature. All the compositions were measured in-house by our mobile lab. We developed a mechanistic basis upon freezing point depression, 1 over temperature as a function of activity for these glasses. It is semi-empirical because I don't know what the activity relationships are in the glass. So we did fit some coefficients, my favorite calibration step. And so we defined a new model based upon this new information with no significant lack of fit that allowed them to predict the crystallization in the melter. Now we do this a little different from Hanford. I'm not going to get into that, where we tend to do mechanistic bases for the models. So we take a little hit on the uncertainty side, on the model side, but we assume that because we've done that, they're going to better capture what you might make in a melt. And I know that's very different. We can have a long argument about that. I don't want to. So again, this was the sort of model they were using that we put in 2002 to predict liquidus temperature, because the original model for liquidus restricted them to mid 20 weight percent sludge in their glass, say 28 maybe at most. And this, as I will show you in a second, so first things first, this is kind of the model as it predicts the current data. If you take those same data and use the old model, I wasn't allowed to show this before I went and got it out of the report. You can see it's kind of like a shotgun pattern. The original model just didn't work. It worked for those glasses. You always have to be worried about your domain when you do something complicated like this. So the new model, as you can see from, say, these two columns, you get, say, from 25 to 35, so about a 10% increase. But it depends on the frit. As you can see here, you get maybe 3% at most, sometimes 2. So it depends on a lot of things as to how much benefit you're going to get from something like this. What I can tell you is that I installed this in 2002 into the control room, and it was the only change that was made since 1996 when I put the original system in. It did increase waste loading in the operating window. The original cost estimate that was done independent from us was about $533 million over the life cycle of DOPF. Like I said, they've run sludge compositions that allowed them to go to 40+% waste loading. So that 25 or 27 to 40 is a big deal. Many fewer cans to have to store. And like I said, that was the only change that I made since 1996. They've redone it now to be able to add more titanium from salt waste processing, but that's the only change that has been made. Those are the only 2 changes since 1996. So that model was very successful. So as I said, I left when I was not happy in my job at Savannah River at that point because I wanted to do other things, and one of them was not ILAW, and so I decided to leave. And it was lucky that the Thursday before the Friday when I was walking out the door, Frank Parker, called me and said, "I hear you're not doing anything. Would you like to work for me in Europe?" And I said, "Let me think about it." And I thought about it for about a millisecond and said, "Sure." And so he asked me to come work for him at the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg in Austria. And so the next part of this is Vienna. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did here. And this is when I wanted Kathy to turn off her mic. So the idea was, how do you look at consequences of hypothetical accidental releases at nuclear risk sites in the Russian Far East? And some of these are based upon not so hypothetical accidents. I have some pictures that I took out because I'm not sure. I wasn't sure where I got them, so I wasn't sure I could show them. But there have been some accidents with the Russian Pacific Fleet. And so how do you model what might happen? So a lot of the interest was from Japan and other places because there have been accidents. And so how do you predict what's going to happen to people? So I did this in concert with a meteorologist, Sasha Mahura, who's out of the Danish Meteorological Institute, who was working also at YASA when I was there. So he did both a trajectory model to look at 5-day forward trajectories for the air packets, if you will, that will transport the contamination. And he also did a long-range transport model to do 5-day atmospheric transport, dispersion, and deposition using the DERMA model out of DMI. And so they did a hypothetical unit release of, 10 to the 10th becquerel per second over, that time you get 8.64 times 10 to the 4th becquerels of cesium-137. And what he did was he estimated, based upon that DERMA model, both the dry and the wet deposition based upon atmospheric data for a 5-year period of atmospheric data, and where the radionuclides would deposit. And so I then took that data and used the UNSCAR 1993 methodology, which is what I told Kathy to turn off, to actually do dose commitment estimates based upon that methodology. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me just check my time here. Okay. So the region of interest is around a couple Russian Far East sites. And, you know, Petropavlovsk has had an issue or two, Vladivostok. And so we looked at the 12 neighboring countries. And basically, I'll just show you a picture. This is when I got started using my MATLAB to do maps. So the two sites are here in the center part of the screen. And it's where those contaminants would move based upon atmospheric conditions. And again, there's some uncertainty because I'll just go to the next one. Sorry, there's background noise. So again, he did wet and dry deposition, where your wet deposition has quite a bit of uncertainty because it's driven by rainfall. And so that's kind of hard to predict moving forward, but it was based upon actual data from atmospheric conditions. And then I also calculated the strontium and the iodine from those cesium. They were highly correlated, so I just assumed they were correlated. And did both cesium, iodine, and strontium for what we saw here. And then this is just transboundary, meaning outside of Russia. The total deposition, becquerels per meter squared, and distance from the source relative to how much you got. And so this is about, I don't know, 6 or 7 pages of about a 100-page presentation and a couple 100-page document. So I'm just trying to give you a flavor for what we were doing. So what I did was I took those deposited values and I estimated effective dose commitments using the Unsgaard 1993 methodology. It's not the only way to do it, may not be the best way to do it, but the nice thing about it is it's multiplicative, as I'll show you in a second, and it lends itself to this sort of sensitivity probabilistic analysis that I ended up doing. So again, your dose commitment is an input times a bunch of multipliers, ingestion, inhalation, gamma, and external ground. And so this is a nice multiplicative way of doing it, and I'll show you a little bit more going on. And then, did I say this here? I say it later. And then if you use that in terms of the dose commitment, and of course they're scaled to how much gets deposited. For the PRS, you know, the regional, which means everywhere, or local and Russia are going to be the same because that's where it's coming out of. For that site, you have to worry about Alaska and the Aleutians first, then Japan, and these are the lists. For Vladivostok, China gets it first because the atmospheric conditions in North Korea, Japan. So Japan always kind of rates, and they were part of the people who were funding this analysis because they were worried about it. And then what I did was I took ResRad to check the calculations I was making. So ResRad was developed by Argonne to support establishing guidelines for residual radioactive material. I kind of took it apart and put it back together to allow me to check the values that I wanted to check, because ResRad, excuse me, let me clear my throat. ResRad is designed to be used by putting in a bunch of inputs and doing calculations. You can also do some probabilistic stuff. But what I had was deposition values, several tens of thousands of deposition values. And it was not something I really want to do, to put in all 10,000 by hand. So there are ways that I use MATLAB and other tools to have ResRad run all those various cases that I needed to. And there's a whole document on that. So basically the Unsgaard values versus what I calculated with ResRad, they agreed pretty well, I thought. So that was my check on what I was calculating. I was also under duress forced to do a collective dose assessment. I'm not going to talk much about that because it seems like that's ripe ground to argue. So if anybody wants to ask me specifically about it, it was done, it's in the report. And I had my own thoughts on that. and how I approach that, which is I use threshold values to kind of look at the sensitivity of the collective dose based upon kind of usual and customary threshold values, which I kind of thought was a interesting way of looking at it. And then I also, and this goes back to something I know Kathy and I've talked about, I looked at varying the parameters in that UNSCAR method, both upon the release fractions, the inventories, the parameters that lead to your P factor for ingestion, inhalation, external exposure, as well as population and, infant versus teen and things like that. So I did an analysis that kind of exploded that or propagated that through that sort of factor, where the UNSCAR P2345 for say ingestion that I used was 55. And if you go through and look at infant versus child versus teen versus adult, and you kind of weight it based upon population, you get another value that is a distribution of values, and I'm just giving the min and maxes here. But you can see that kind of does bound what I used in the original UNSCAR for adult. But as you can see, there's lots of variation in these sort of parameters. And if you look at the very bottom, it's about a half of what I used in the UNSCAR analysis to about 5x, which I probably, according to Kathy, I don't know, that might seem low on the only 5 times higher. But it was a way to kind of get an idea of how good or bad that original estimate was. And then basically, the driver was cesium 137, teens for 137, for strontium and iodine, it tended to be infants. And then in the transboundary region, there didn't seem to be a lot of room for concern. There obviously was dose, but it was not exceedingly high doses. And that's actually what this says. So even the worst case scenarios seem to have relatively minor effects, and that's from somebody who doesn't live there, obviously. And I would suggest if you're in Russia, you don't eat reindeer. And I can tell you why. So that's kind of the bottom line of that study. It's a very interesting study. There have been several journal articles written about it. And if anybody's interested, I can supply. And then why I was in Austria, and this is another interesting story, because I come from DOE world. So I was in DOE for 16 years. And on a Thursday, Frank comes to me and says, Kevin, we're going to China on Monday. Now, if you live in DOE world, the thought of on a business trip on a Thursday, finding out you're going to China on a Monday, that just does not compute. But if you're Frank and the guy who runs the domestic nuclear program in China, who had the second most employees working for him of anyone in the world next to the British healthcare system, guess what? You can get a visa by Monday. So we were on our way to China on that Monday. And this is just my little picture. And I'm going to apologize to everyone who knows how to pronounce these words and these cities, because they've been working with me, I can tell you, but I just don't get it right. So it was an interesting trip. We looked at both trying to talk to them about remediating the uranium mining site, which is an acid mining site near Kazakhstan in Yaning. But I think it's 800 kilometers west. I don't think it's 80. I think it's 800 kilometers west of Urumqi. And so that's the same ore field that the Russians and Kazakhs and other have been mining out of. And if you use acid leach, what tends to happen is you'll always have rebound once you stop pumping water through it. And so that's something we talked to them about. And then they had a mill tailing site where they by rail shipped all the mill tailings from the domestic nuclear program into one place near Henyang. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that was, they put up, I think it was 11 or 12 dams around a valley, put all the mill tailings in. And when we were there, they were still thinking of how they were going to cover that mill tailing site. So it was an interesting place. I'm not going to worry about that though. We did a lot of eating when we were in China. The upper right is there's a city carved out of sandstone, I think along the Silk Route. where we went in and they asked the caretakers to feed us lunch, which was interesting. So that was interesting. That may be a much younger version of me, kind of in the upper right. And then in the lower right, Suwana's told me she's familiar with this dish. The thing I've blown up is turtle that's been boiled for about a week. And the meat's been removed and there are hard-boiled pheasant eggs in the shell. So that's what I'm trying to blow up. But it was that was an interesting meal. So like I said, a lot of my early years, both at Savannah River and Yasa, were due to Frank Parker. And this is us in Yanning, and they were trying to find stuff to fit Frank because Frank was a big dude. And so that's the best we could do. We got trash bags over his feet, and the lab coat didn't quite fit. So, like I said, that's how I got to Savannah River and then to Europe. And then when I left there briefly, I came back. So I realized once I left Yasa that my last chance to get a PhD was at that time period. So David Costin took a chance. He reached out to me, I think at Frank's request, to see if I was interested in getting a PhD. So 2003, after Yasa, I came back. I'll just say, now there are jobs. So if you're like Sue, probably it's different, but you know, you'll notice my international travels for business, and this is just business because I could have shown you the dozen trips we made to the Italian Alps and stuff when I lived in Vienna. So you can see if you want to internationally travel, you know, Savannah River may not be your place unless you get to a certain position or have a job that requires you to go to these places. My job didn't. So, you know, David took a chance. I came back to get my PhD. It had been about 17 years since I had taken a class, and Sue can commiserate. I don't know if Sue is on, because I think hers is even longer. I did change my PhD topic after a year. I didn't like it, and so we talked about it, and I changed my topic. Got my PhD in 2008 under David again with Frank and John Garrick and other people, Jim Clark and other people who are on my committee, Maha. Develop a risk assessment framework and gold sim model, Ellicott shell land burial disposition. Then because I was worried about insurance and having kids, and insurance for kids, I was about to take a job with the NRC in 2008 timeframe. I was not quite done yet. And David offered me a job to stay on just right before I finished so I wouldn't have to go to DC and live in Maryland on the rail line and all those other fun things. So David took a couple chances. I'd like to think it worked out, but we'd have to ask him. So became a professor in 2015, now part of the Crest Management Board. As Lara pointed out, you know, life cycle risk evaluation related to cementitious barriers. Subject matter expert on a bunch of DOE project reviews for the WTP at Hanford, for the salt waste processing facility at Savannah River. Got to do fun things like hydrogen calcs and flammability calcs for salt zone disposal units. Most recently, we're on the FFRDC team that looked at supplemental treatment for Hanford Law. As I like to say, in the first time in history, I believe, we talked about grout for low activity waste in Hanford. Ecology said that we were on the right path. And as I told Bill Bates, he should have just taken the mic and dropped it because that had never been said before. So that was, I think, a very, very successful team. Just real quick, and I know I'm running out of time, but nobody's stopping me, so I'll blame you guys. One of the things I've been working on most recently is uncertainty analysis for the Hanford tank farm system. So there are 149 single shell tanks and 28 double shell tanks. So you got a tank within a tank is a double shell tank. Single shell tank is just a tank in the environment. There's 50 plus million gallons of waste. It's got supernatant, it's got sludge and salt cake, which is supernatant if you take out the water. That has both radioactive and hazardous constituents. And so, like I said, the FFRZC study was looking at part of that waste fraction, the low activity, high volume fraction. There's also a low volume, high activity fraction that is being looked at. And this managing tank waste at Hanford is the most complex and expensive part of their cleanup, which itself is the largest and most expensive cleanup project in history. And I'm not going to say that there aren't places that are more contaminated than Hanford, especially in other countries, but in the US, it's certainly number one. What we used to start this analysis was what's called the best basis inventory, which has the best inventory estimates for all 177 of the tanks, including 158 that still have waste that needs to be retrieved. So they've retrieved waste from several single shell tanks and one double shell tank into other double shell tanks, because that's where the feed for the processing is going to happen. So there are 46 radionuclides they keep track of and 25 chemicals by phase and waste type. And I'll get more into that in a second. That's kind of what's used for inventory planning, and a lot of the planning that gets done at Hanford is basically that best basis inventory without uncertainty. So you have uncertainties in those. You have uncertainties in the concentrations, the volumes, the densities. This all propagates through these models that they use to figure out how they're going to plan, what they're going to do after they retrieve the waste, what residuals are left, how fast you can process this stuff, how much waste form you're going to make, glass or grout, if you get the grout, and what the dose estimates are going to be. So there's lots of potential uses for this information. As I can say, this kind of the middle in the circle is that best basis inventory, which is part of what they call tank waste inventory network system twins. I think I got that right. And their model now is called TopSim that they use for planning. Sorry, I went too fast, but let's just say there's a lot of stuff that best basis inventory feeds. So the idea here is to develop inventory and volume estimates under uncertainty for what's in the tank before it gets retrieved, what gets retrieved, and they have a whole plan for how the tank retrievals are going to go. So we use that. What you get out of the tank, what you get once you treat it with either glass or grout, the residuals that are left in the tank, and all of those have uncertainties. So all that information is captured in a GoldSim model that uses that best basis inventory as input. I'll show you in a second. There's several 100,000 inputs that come out of BBI that go into GoldSim, and millions of outputs that one can get out of the GoldSim model. It's a big model. I'll talk about it. I'll just talk about it now. I actually, due to memory issues, because GoldSim is a 32-bit application when it should be a 64-bit application, I've had to divide it into a West area model, a 200 East area model, and 200 West area model to get enough realizations out of it to make the information worthwhile. So here's kind of the flow. In the upper left, you have the best basis inventory. That comes out as something that looks like a spreadsheet, even though it's not, but you can look at it in Excel. I developed a bunch of MATLAB scripts that take this information and put it into a bunch of Excel files that can then feed GoldSim. This is kind of how it works in terms of information flow. So the GoldSim model, and it's not pretty because it's not meant to be pretty yet. I'll hang dashboards on it later. So the whole system is in the model, all 177 tanks with their information from the BBI. There are ways that they calculate the inventory, that's in there. What they call vector concentrations, which is the concentration, the best concentration they have, species, leach and wash factors, multipliers, volumes. So all this stuff is in GoldSim. And when they look at uncertainties and these compositions, they do it by waste phase type. So the phases are things like supernatant, sludge, salt cake, interstitial liquid, things like that. And then they have what they call waste type, which is like where it came from or what it is. And as you can see in the lower right, it says 340,000 inputs. About a third of those are from the BBI. And then you can see the output says about 3.4 million. So it's a big model. And this was before I split it in two, which I did in the last month. So I updated all this. The original reason we did a model like this was to look at the reinterpretation for high level waste. And I did a lot of work in a spreadsheet, and the first version of this recreating what I did in that spreadsheet for the 2018 analysis for the reinterpretation of the Hanford tank waste. That is, does it meet nuclear regulatory low-level waste criteria? What you would have to do. So that was all the original version of this. I updated the BBI from that 2018 version to 2023. That is all the information, including there have been retrievals from the 241AX tank farm that have happened since. So all this has been put in. I added a bunch of new information, which is retrievals in the DST system by layer, based upon Mike Britton's information. That allows you to target a undissolved solids to 20%, even though when you do it, you only can get to 18.5. So there's a lot of new information. I put in the revised hydrogen generation rate model, liquid speed G calculations, unit liter dose calcs, charge balancing. There's a lot of stuff that has gone into this in the last, say, 3 months. We're also looking at doing a probabilistic way of calculating feed vectors. A lot of that's in here, but there's still some stuff left to do. So when I propagate the uncertainties through the model, I get something that makes sense relative to what was written in the tank closure and waste management EIS, which is, 100% give or take for a lot of these things, iodine, technetium. When you look at what actually has uncertainties associated with them, about 29% of the things that have non-zero concentrations in the BBI actually have a relative standard deviation associated with them. That was supposed to be cleaned up, but it's a very thorny calculation when you don't have a sample estimate, when you're doing it based upon, say, the Hanford defined waste inventory and how that works. It's very thorny. It's very difficult. That's why it hasn't been done. It wasn't because people didn't look at it. It's just really tough. So they're still looking at that. I did my own version of that here. So as you can see, some of what you'll get is the classification levels within a tank farm. You may get up to 3 or 4 tanks that may change classification out of, say, 12 tanks, typically in a tank farm. So when you look at this, this is kind of the information. I know it's hard to see. I got 10 minutes, I think. So you'll see in the far right, it says inventory calculation. So if you look down and could scan, and if it wasn't so small, you notice that there are multiple specific gravities. The volume's all the same, but the specific gravity is different. You'll see a concentration, you'll see a volume, you'll see a specific gravity, translate to mass, a conversion factor, that's the 001, and then a multiplier, which is 1, which does not relate to the specific gravity, but to other things. Because you'll see that the multiplier looks like it should relate to the specific gravity, but it's not. So you have to capture all of these, and you can see this is one tank farm, one waste phase, one waste type. And the calculations are different based upon what constituent you're looking at. So this, one of the reasons the model is as complex as it is, you have to capture all this kind of information to get the model to work correctly. As you can see, even in the inventory RSD, you'll see some of them have relative standard deviations, and the one means 100%. So the bismuth is about 100% relative standard deviation. The chloride's about 10. So you can see it varies. You'll notice the mercury and the lanthanum don't have RSDs. So what does one do when one does not have a relative standard deviation? So again, if you go back to the BBI, 46 rads, 25 chemicals, 7 waste phases, salt cake to supernatant. There are 141 waste types. It's like stream, origin, process, where it came from. And so this information is given based upon a combination of the phase and the waste type. And you'll have between 1 and 30 combinations of those 169 representing what's in each of the tanks. So it's pretty interesting to keep track of all that in any system. And I know the guys who do top sim understand this because they have to do very similar stuff. So when I process the new version of the BBI, again, about 29% of the 42,000 plus concentrations that were non-zero actually had RSDs with them. So the question is, what do you do about the missing stuff? What do you do about do you just ignore the 71% that don't have uncertainty estimates? Or what do you do about that? So to begin that conversation, I went through and first looked at all the waste phase types to see if there was enough information associated with them that I could do, if it's missing, just use something that already exists as a waste phase type. The answer is too sparse. You just couldn't do it. So what I did was, instead of doing it by waste and phase type, I just did it by phase. So each constituent by phase, I looked at all the relative standard deviations they had, and each represents a distribution. And then even if that's missing, let's say there's a constituent that you have you have a constituent that does not exist, that has no RSDs in that phase. What do you do then? Well, the nice thing is PNL defined a series of analogs that I could use, and I'll show you. So if I look at this distribution, you'll see the upper left is salt cake solid, cesium-137, and there are 66 different relative standard deviations that have been used to describe salt cake for cesium-137 throughout the entire system. This is not by waste type because I didn't have that sort of information. And you see it ranges from very low to about 100%. For the sludge in the middle, and what you'll typically see is sludges are more uncertain than salt cake or supernatant, which makes sense because how they're measured. You'll see the sludge for americium, you got 55. And again, it's actually not that much higher than the salt cake cesium, but you see you're getting almost a couple 100% here. Supernatant, you'll see is everything is less than is less than 50%, which makes sense. The interesting thing that I noticed here was when I went to TOC for sludge solid, I saw these. Now you have to multiply the abscissa by 100. That's a big uncertainty. So I went and took a look at that to see what the heck. And what that is actually the annular solids in AY102, which was retrieved. So that's not really meaningful to the rest of the process. So I did take those out, and I'm not using those uncertainties for the rest of the analysis. Again, if things are missing, a series of analogs, they might not be all the ones that I use, but I figure this is, the P&L people are smarter than I am about this, so I use their analogs. So let's say you have, let me pick one, tech, but you have measured that. Cesium-134, use cesium-137 if you didn't measure it. A lot of these, if you don't have the isotopic for uranium, you're using the total. So that makes sense. So a lot of these make good sense. So that's what I use. So basically how we went through this was if you have an RSD, use it. If you don't, first you go to that distribution of relative standard deviations by phase and constituent, and hopefully there's one in that. And then since it's a distribution, you have to pick a value. And since this is basically calculated values, not sampled values, we use the maximum of that distribution for each of them. You don't have to, you could use an upper percentile, you could use something else, but actually uncertainties can be uncertain. So one can make the case that that might not be the best way to handle it. And then if it's, and about 42% I could cover that way. If there was nothing in that sample distribution of the RSDs for that constituent by that phase, then I used the substitution defined by PNNL. And just to point out, the 2018 and the 2023 results were pretty similar. One second. Sorry. And then just some results. Now these are just for 50 because I was under the gun to do this presentation when I put it together. I've not had time to revise it. Right now, each of the West and East models will do 300 plus realizations. So you get much better distributions out of those. And it's basically for anything in the BBI that you can think of, by phase, by type, whether it's grouted, whether it's assumed grouted or made or vitrified, you can get this sort of distribution information out of it. I also, after talking to Bechtel and others, they were looking at the DF-HLW preliminary waste acceptance criteria. So I also added those to the model. And this is done by DST layer that would be retrieved. So there are things like uranium fissile to total uranium, which can be problematic, I'm told. And so if you look at the distributions, 1 means you're right at the limit. Greater than 1 means you've exceeded the limit. Less than 1 means you're okay. So things like fissile to total uranium, you can see that one could become problematic. things like the co-located worker unit leader dose, which is what CLWULD means. Sorry about that. You're fine. That one you'd have trouble getting anywhere near. The sulfur is not a high level waste, DFHLW WAC. It was provided by John Vienna in terms of difficulty or ease of making glass out of it, because sulfur can cause issues with a joule heated melter. So if it's too high, it can lead to problems. As you can see, that one can be also problematic because all of them exceed 1 for that layer. Now, the interesting thing about the layers is the layers are going to be mixed. The layers are going to be blended. So just because you might have this one layer that exceeds things, you're going to blend it with something else as you move it through the DST system to kind of obviate these sorts of issues. But it's always good to know what you start with when you start blending. So this gives you an idea of how you would blend. So again, use the RSDs in the current BBI. You can get, I said 1 to 3. It's 1 to 4 tanks that could change classification. We can provide uncertainty informations now up through DST, getting close to feed vector, but there's still a little more work left to do. We still have to look at the template based. That is the one that has the high uncertainty that now we're using the max from the distribution. That could use more work, but again, that is very thorny analysis. And it's all bias actually, so it becomes even more interesting. I don't want to get into a stat thing, but that one becomes very difficult to work through, which is again why it hasn't been done, even though it was, it was said to where it was going to be done in 2003. So in terms of getting to the feed vectors, there are zero order wash and leach factors that now are in GoldSim that I'm not using because I've just stopped at DFHLW. There is an integrated solubility model that could be used, and I would have to define a DLL to do that. That can be done. That's how TopSim does it now. But that would be future work. And there's some also things to look at glass processing that John Vienna has provided me that has not been done. So lots of stuff left to do. So again, how I got from Vanderbilt to Savannah River, Frank Parker. How I got from Savannah River to YASA, Frank Parker. How I got from YASA to Vanderbilt, David Cosson. Why I'm still at Vanderbilt, David Cosson. So you can blame him, I guess. So, some parting words, and I'd love to have questions. Oh, it's ready too. So I will just say that not everyone, I'm going to read this because it took me a while. Not everyone can learn the work ethic from my father, born in a log cabin with a dirt floor to tenant farmers in rural Indiana at the beginning of the Great Depression, but it does help. So there's a famous comedian who's now infamous, who tells a story in a famous Toronto stand-up, even though he was sitting in a chair, about every time he'd ask his dad for 50 cents to go to the movies, his dad would tell him his life story, including how he once killed a bear on the way to school with his loose leaf notebook. So yes, that's kind of the flip side of having a father like that. I owe a great deal to my mentors. I had great mentors along the way, Frank, David, to name just two. Get the best help you can. Sometimes it's worth the effort to get them the help. That was the Dick Postal story, because DOPF would not have started up with the success that it had without him helping. I've always had issues with work-life balance, but find one that suits you and your family. And still the best way to solve problems, I still think, is, your gut is there. It's called the second brain for a reason, but you got to pair it with analytical thinking to make things work. So I'm going to stop because I'm tired of talking, and I'm sure you're tired of listening to me. And so please, if there are any questions. And Kathy, I'm not answering anything on dose commitments.
No comment.
All right. Are there any questions for Kevin? Just go on ahead.
Yeah, I have one quick question. This is Aaron White. Can you guys
Hi,
hear me?
Aaron. Yes.
Hey, okay. So, could you talk a little bit about the differences between working internationally and working locally? Like, were there, I imagine work-life balance is probably crazy regardless, but was there any nuances to working internationally that was pro or con versus working locally?
Well, and it's, part of that is where you work. So there couldn't have been a much better place than I lived right off the main cathedral area in Vienna. Um, so again, it would not be fair to most places that you would probably work internationally, at least in that field. Um, but as I tell people, if you get the chance to work internationally, have a compelling reason not to, because you'd be amazed at what you learn when you leave the U.S. when you live outside the U.S. for a time. Now, the flip side is, and it's more on the professional side, um, after a certain amount of time, and it depends on the industry. In engineering, it's kind of 2-ish to 5-ish years, even though I know of people who've worked longer. Sometimes it's a little harder to come back to the US and find the job you want. But it's years, it's not months. Um, but I mean, it was just, I mean, the public transportation system. And I tell the story when I came back to the US, I'm like, you know, I'm gonna take public transportation to work. So I lived, 7 minutes from Vanderbilt by car. And the first time I tried to take the bus to Vanderbilt, I had to walk 20 minutes, pick up a bus that took me downtown, to pick up another bus that took me to the other side of Vanderbilt, and then another 15-minute walk to my office. And I'm like, well, I may be driving the 7 minutes because you couldn't bike there because you'd die trying to bike. Um, so, there are things that are great. The lifestyle is very different. You shop every day. Once you become native, you're eating at the Nosh Markt, you're doing all this stuff. I developed a coffee habit I didn't have before. Um, it was very weird, as you might guess, Aaron, the first time I went to lunch and everybody's drinking booze. So it's not really the DOE style, as you might guess. A lot of things are easier and some things are harder. Um, you know, I missed the US, so I came back. And I love, it wasn't that I didn't love Vienna, because it was a great city. And we got to go to, I spent, Christmas in the Italian Alps with friends who came in out of Atlanta. We, went to Prague where my brother lived, several times. Went to Germany, went just all over the place, and you just take a train. And so, it's fantastic. The traveling is fantastic. The lifestyle takes a little getting used to as an American, as you might guess. Um, I got lucky and unlucky because I took German in school, so I wanted to really practice my German. But Vienna is sort of like Paris, that let's just say they'd rather you speak English. Maybe that was just they'd rather me speak English. I don't know. It's probably my butchering of German. But in the little town Luxembourg, they spoke German there, except for the people I worked with. I worked with a bunch of Russians. I learned to have high tea. It was fantastic. So, like I said, if you get the chance, have a compelling reason not to go. But if you get a chance to go overseas and live, I think it's very, very beneficial on many fronts. Sorry, that was not what you asked me, but that's how I answered.
Close enough, thanks.
Hey,
Glenn,
Dr. Brown, I have a quick question if that's
please.
okay. Thank you for your presentation. Earlier when you were talking about like your work at the Savannah River National Lab and you had like the statistical process control thing that you were working on,
Yep.
were there ever any disagreements between you and anybody else with like, I don't know, what assumptions to make or how to best implement it? Like, I know, for example, you mentioned like 2 sigma or something like that. What were there ever any like discussions like how do we choose how accurate we want to be and things like that?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I tell people, what they tell you when you come back to, the world is that everybody, when you present, wants you to succeed. Well, it's interesting you've asked me that because typically when I presented on our process control strategy, at least half of the people wanted me to fall flat on my face because the way we did it at Savannah River and has been working since 1996 is very different than what they did at West Valley or what they plan to do at Hanford. Not wrong, not better, different. So when I walked in the early 90s, they wanted to sample every canister of glass that we made and do a 95 tolerance interval on those measurements. That is really hard to do. You got to do a little throat sampler. It's a pain in the butt to get all that done. And the first thing I did was I sat down and said, look, your tolerance interval, what are your assumptions? And the first thing this guy said was Gaussian. I was like, then you don't need to do it, because your assumption is driving your statistics, not the other way around. And so the first thing we did was got rid of the 95-95. Then we got rid of sampling every canister and just doing one for a macro batch. So this 533 million, that's kind of small potatoes relative to the other stuff we did. We argued over everything. We had a technical review group that came in, and we started talking about is it a n versus n minus one, q dimensional space, blah, just stuff like. So during that, I would spend all night simulating things to show that the PNL guy, even though he was a good theoretical statistician, was not that practical in what we had to do. So we went through a lot of that. And it was just really a lot of not invented here. And like I said, and there are certain things, I mean, should be done different at the Savannah River, in my opinion. But it works well enough. And could you make it a little higher waste loading? You could. If you added trim chemicals and dealt with all the stuff they're dealing with trying to get them into WTP, you could do that. But it works. And it's made, lots of glass. And they have not changed much since, like I said, 96. So to get through that process, and you have to have pretty thick skin, because also, I was like your guys' ages. Actually, I was probably younger. I was telling a bunch of old guys like me with PhDs what to do, and they didn't like that. But there was kind of a dearth of decision making. And so if you're willing to kind of take that on and suffer that, because I had guys saying, I don't know how many samples you want to take as long as it's one, I'd have to say, well, that's crazy. There's a lot of stuff you have to deal with if you're, but you have to have pretty thick skin. If you met my family, you'd know I have thick skin, but there's a lot of stuff you have to go through to get something like that in place. And I had a lot of help. I mean, Sharon Mara, who's like number 2 in the lab, she was on the plant side. It was a great team that we put together to make this work. It was not just me doing it. I showed Carol, this glass study I'm showing, it had P&L people on it, had Tommy Edwards as a statistician, had me, had Carol Jansen, who's one of the better glass chemists in the world. It had, it was only because we had great teamwork that made this work.
Thank you.
But it's an interesting question, because like I said, I'm trying not to get into that, but there were lots of, it was very contentious to get this, and really we did this. Remember, I don't know how many of you look at Hanford. I came in the early 90s, and we were running DOPF with a full product control strategy in 1996. So it was like a handful of years. That could only have been done, in my opinion, at Savannah River at that time. So, and with those people that I worked with. So I got one of the better statisticians, did the first blasting cap study for airbags when he was at DuPont Engineering. Had Carol Jansen, that was Dick Postles, had Tommy Edwards. Without those people, it would not have happened. I was standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say. And they were dumb enough to listen to me. What are you going to do? Anything else? Great, Lara. Thank you. I guess.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. It was a great talk. We really appreciate it.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Have a great Friday.